Welcome to Let's Talk Democracy. I'm Tina Johnson, your host. Join me as we talk to the people on the front lines, the change makers and activists who are building a stronger, healthier democracy for all of us. Whether you're looking for expert advice, a new perspective, or just a little inspiration, this is where you'll find it. You can feel it almost everywhere these days, a kind of unease about democracy. In the United States, in Europe, across Latin America and Asia, people are questioning whether democracy is still working for them. Trust in institutions has eroded, truth itself feels negotiable, and voices once considered extreme are now part of the mainstream conversation. And let's face it, it's not just one country or one ideology. From Donald Trump in the US to Viktor Orban in Hungary, Marine Le Pen in France, and Giorgia Meloni in Italy. We're seeing the same pattern repeat. Leaders rising to power through elections, only to weaken the very democratic norms that brought them there. Many explanations focus on economics, that democracies aren't delivering the job, security, or stability people want. But maybe the story runs deeper. Maybe the real crisis isn't just material. It's emotional and perceptual. A crisis of trust, belonging, and belief. In today's episode, Authoritarian Populism and the Crisis of Perception, I'm joined by Professor Thomas Weber, a historian and political thinker and founding director of the Center of Global Security and Governance at the University of Aberdeen. And he's also an award-winning author. Today, we'll talk about why people turn toward authoritarian populists, what history can teach us, and how we might still renew democracy in an age of disinformation and division. Let's get into it. Tom, thanks for joining me today. I really wanted to have this conversation with you on authoritarian populism because of the work that you've done and the books that you've written. And I thought, this would be a really good opportunity to talk to a historian about our democracy narratives that are happening around the world.
I'm very happy to be here. I'd be even happier if there was no need to have this conversation. But short of that, I'm really, really delighted. Thank you so much for having me.
So I wanted to jump in with this question for you to start us off. What do you see as the main forces driving the democratic backsliding in Western democracies today? So we'll just start off with a light question.
I guess the $10 million question. I think it's really the confluence of two things that are coming together. It's a perception to be living in a world of crisis, the perception that we're encountering the kind of crisis in which the individual and collective survival is no longer assured. And that is coming together with sudden disruptive innovation in the means of mass communication. So today, of course, the internet, the digital innovation, but we've seen this before. We've been there in the past. I mean, we've seen in the past, for instance, the interwar years, a world of crisis perception coming together with sudden disruptive innovation in the means of mass communication. At the time, it was newsreels in cinemas, radio, even speakers at public events so that you could suddenly turn events into mega events. And for whatever reason, it is false prophets who seem to be far more talented of exploiting these new opportunities that come with these new innovations at a moment like this, where people somehow really feel that those up there don't have what it takes to get us out of the crisis, maybe even got us in the crisis in the first place. I think it's those two things that need to come together to get us into the situation where we are.
Yeah, I want to unpack those two things. And so when you talk about a crisis of perception and this widespread feeling that those up there can't get us out of this feeling or this experience that we're having, can you unpack that a bit for the listeners?
Sure, of course. Maybe your listeners also would like to hear why I keep on saying crisis perception rather than crisis. Obviously, you normally also need to have a crisis for this, something like that to happen. So something objectively speaking that is really, really bad. But what is even more important is that people perceive the social reality in which they are as a big, big crisis. We all encounter hardship all the time. But that's not so unusual. That, in a way, is the norm. That has been the norm in human history. I think we also underestimate how much resilience there has been in human history. But the problem is, once people start to think, well, this is different, so this time we won't get out of here. This time the challenge is of a totally different magnitude. Then we have a real problem. And obviously crisis perception and real crises are related to each other. So in a way, the fact that this is happening now after whatever, the financial crisis of 2008, the COVID-19 crisis, and we could go on and on and on. Of course, it makes sense that it happens at a moment of this kind. But at the same time, it's also worth remembering that in the way we are living in the best world that we've ever lived in, or at least the world globally lives in the best world we've ever lived in. Of course, a lot of people are not encountering a very pleasant present, but compared to any time in history, globally, people never lived as long. It's not just how long they lived, but also how well they lived, whether they had access to healthcare. Absolute poverty has fallen in most places. But the question is not just whether, objectively speaking, that is the case, but what the perception of that is. And of course, also with all of these kind of changes, there's always losers. And it's maybe no coincidence that it is particularly in advanced industrial societies that some people really feel worried. So, for instance, if we look at the United States, we know kind of the white working classes have fallen behind. So, yes, globally, everyone is better off, or almost everyone is better off. But, for instance, the white working classes in the United States is not. And so, in that sense, you can understand why people start to feel a sense of existential anxiety. And it is once that is spreading that we get into a real problem.
I think that framing is important because what globally is consistent, like when you look at the rise of figures like Donald Trump or Viktor Orban and Giorgia Meloni, that what they've done is position themselves as defenders of the people, I put that in quotation marks, against the so-called elites. And in some ways, that so-called elitism tend to galvanize around a certain community, in this case, as you said, white, working class, feeling like they're up against everyone and the system is against them. And so I'm wondering if these are the symptoms of deeper structural problems, or are these folks, Donald Trump, Orban, Meloni, able to reshape democracy itself in new ways by leveraging this feeling of being othered?
That's a very good question. And I think it's almost impossible to answer because I don't think it's an either or. We're obviously seeing huge structural changes in not just Western countries, but throughout the world. And the kind of figures that you have just mentioned are surfing on that. They're exploiting that. Of course, not just for tactical reasons. I think most of them are also true believers. So they think that they are genuinely trying to improve the situation. I never believe this kind of story where we somehow reduce the people we may not like or are up against as somehow just being sinister people who are just driven by a quest for power or whatever else. I think we should take very seriously what people on the extreme right or extreme left, for that matter, and what extremists believe. And of course, also we should take seriously how disruptive, again, the change in the means of mass communication is, and maybe even more so than in the past. If we look at how the digital sphere works, how the way social media is set up, any kind of divisive behavior generally pays off, while any attempt to try to bring people together will not get you any likes. That is, of course, also something that those kind of false prophets do really exploit brilliantly.
I wanted to follow up with that because you talk about mass communication, and you and I've talked about previously about the difference, or how in the 1920s and the 1930s, what was available was the radio. And now, as you just mentioned, you have the digital platforms, you have the internet, and how that's sort of creating this opportunity for there to be this narrative that's put out in the world from this very populist perspective, leveraging the fears and the insecurities of people regarding what they feel their society, their democratic society, should be providing for them. From your perch as a historian, how has the switch or the change with mass communication sort of benefited the rise of populism and then creating the narrative that those above us are not doing enough to help us or they can't get us out of this?
I think it's two things. I mean, one is, of course, just the way mass communication works, but it's also the other thing is the kind of narratives that are being pushed by people who are challenging the status quo. And in a way, it's a bit weird that this is happening because, in a way, there is no reason why defenders of the status quo, or actually, if you frame it out as defenders of the status quo, because that already sounds negative, if people at the liberal center, they would be able to provide a positive narrative as well. But both in the interwar years as well as today, often the solution of people at the center of politics seems to be that a crisis is there to be solved through good policy rather than through good communication. And of course, I mean, obviously you need both. I mean, good communication as such wouldn't be enough, but challengers such as Orban, Trump, Wilders, and so many others, they're not concerned with coming up with detailed policy, but they are coming up with a persuasive narrative. And for whatever reason, there's not really a persuasive counter narrative to that. And again, we've seen this in the past. I mean, Mussolini said explicitly quite often in the 1920s, look, we do not need yet another list of policy proposals. We need people with the right kind of virtues. We need people who are decisive. We need real men who can get us out of there. So they basically turn it into a story of character. And I think we see this again in today's world, is that challengers turn this again into a question of virtue and of character, rather than saying, look, we need to solve this and this specific policy problems. It becomes those big kind of narratives that appeal to the emotion, the anxieties of people at a moment of this kind. And so I think that is really what is happening. There's, of course, a major difference between the interwar years and now, in the sense that everyone can have their own channel. So in the interwar years, the number of people who were running a newspaper or who had a radio station or something like that was, of course, very limited. So they could, of course, suddenly have enormous influence because much more than before, they could broadcast it right into the living room of people, or with newspapers, they could suddenly get into everyone's home. Also, bear in mind that until not so long previous to that time, most people couldn't really read. But now, suddenly, we were living in a democratic age where almost everyone could read. And now also newspapers, illustrated magazines for the masses were being produced, where that kind of story could be spread. Today, things are both more easier and more difficult. More difficult because there is no longer dominant media. So in theory, we should have this kind of huge democratic marketplace of ideas where everyone can come up with their own ideas. In a way, we have millions and millions of channels. Everyone has their own news channel. But the reality is, of course, that most of those news channels, they're just amplifiers of certain kind of voices. So in a way, this is a market where it's even more important to be a good demagogue, or to be a good, or to put it positively, a good communicator. Because as long as the means of mass communication are being dominated by relatively few media organizations, there is still a way, even for a politician who is not a good communicator, to get the story out. But in today's media world or digital world, it's very difficult to get through if you're an excellent policymaker, but if you can't communicate your ideas. While whoever just comes up with the best one-liner will spread through this world. In addition to that, and that maybe slightly contradicts what I've just said, is that in a way, we have no longer a few organizations that dominate the media market. But in a way, of course, it's both the abandonment of that as well as the total return to it. And what I mean with that is that, of course, now social media platforms are being dominated by very few individuals and companies. So, for instance, if we look at X, the marketplace of ideas is now run by the richest man in the world, who, if he honestly and genuinely would provide equal access to everyone, then that might still be fine. But the problem is that he is not doing that. He is not giving equal access to everyone, but he is pushing certain kind of political ideas and accounts that are in line with his own ideas. And he mutes or muffles voices that go against his ideas. So it's not necessarily that they're totally banned, but you don't totally need to ban a voice on X if you just make sure that that voice no longer appears on your timeline, or you would have got to scroll for so long, you would have to doom scroll all day through your timeline to even get to those messages. So therefore, actually, we have now the danger of very few people dominating the marketplace of ideas today. And someone like Elon Musk has now more influence over public opinion than any institution one can imagine, I think, ever had in the past.
One of the things that I think is very important in understanding sort of something that you just said around this narrative shift is why it is so difficult for the liberal center, as you call them, to create a narrative that resonates. Because it seems like the winning narrative is focused on grievance, nostalgia, and fear. So you have the grievance, nostalgia, and fear that helps mobilize supporters. And if that is the narrative that is winning people over, and you say that there isn't really a persuasive argument, that is scary as hell. Because it's almost like people would rather be in a state of angst and anxiety than to be in a mindset of opportunity, hope, and what's possible, the possibilities. And so if you were going to go out on a limb and be a future forward-looking historian, and you could say, this is the message that would resonate, and it's hypothetical, that could break through what you called the false prophets, what would it be? I mean, what could it be that could be a narrative that potentially could have impact?
I think it's really not that difficult. It's really the story of hope. You're absolutely right. It is difficult at a moment in which, for whatever reason, anxiety and fear has taken hold to come up with this hopeful counter narrative. And I'll tell you in a second why I think it's difficult. But I think it just needs to be attempted, and I don't think it's impossible. It's also, I mean, we don't need to go back that much in history to actually find hopeful narratives that were resonating. Look at how Barack Obama was campaigning in the 2000s. That was very much a narrative of hope. Now we can endlessly discuss whether or not we liked Barack Obama's policies and so on. That is, at the moment, beside the point. The point is Barack Obama understood that the policy of hope, actually also at a time where people maybe are worried, can really work. And I just don't see at the moment that a lot of people even try to come up with that policy of hope. So I think what we're seeing at the moment, not just in America, but around the world, is the attempt to emulate what extremists are doing, to come up with a kind of B version of what extremists are proposing, and thinking that therefore they can kind of contaminate what the stories of, or maybe not even contaminate them. I mean, so let me take this back, because that's precisely what's not happening. They come up with these B versions of those narratives in the hope that somehow then people will stop to support these extremists and go back to the center of politics. But it's self-defeating, because by doing so, people inadvertently validate the concerns expressed by these extremists, and rather than coming up with a hopeful story. So I think we really need to totally break out of that. And for instance, if now in most Western countries at the moment, the narrative seems to be migration is the mother of all problems. And sure, of course, migration is causing trouble. So I'm not trying to somehow say, well, look, there's nothing to see here. But the question is, why is the perception taking hold? It's the mother of all problems. And I think that has a lot to do with a psychological process that is well known through the ages, which sometimes is called mortality salience. So that when we're inundated with images and stories of death, of destruction, of suffering, of misery, that at that point a psychological process sets in where people start to stick to their own kind, where tribalism sets in, where their own worldview is being pushed even more so to the top and everything else is excluded. That kind of tribalism sets in where anyone who either looks different or acts a little bit different or comes from outside is seen as an existential threat at this moment of perceived real fear. And in that sense, I find it utterly unsurprising that it wasn't just now, but also in the early 1920s, that migration suddenly was presented as the mother of all problems. So, for instance, Article 8 of the 1920 Nazi Party program was precisely about that. It was about trying to undo the migration of the previous 10 years. And we're seeing something similar today. The problem is now if politicians at the center of politics say, look, people are really, really worried about all this migration, and we can't win back their support unless we'll actually take their concerns seriously. And taking their concerns seriously then means to come up with a B version of what extremists demand in terms of migration. Not realizing that, sure, even though people are starting to get really worried about migration as the mother of all problems, that this is triggered by this psychological process, and that you cannot undo the psychological process, nor can you undo the support people give to these extremists by just giving into that narrative. What you need to do is to say, sure, there are very real problems with migration. Let's solve them. But this is precisely not the mother of all problems. There are much bigger problems. Here they are, and we can solve them. We've been here before. And so you can turn these kind of stories, even of crisis, into something positive if you basically say, look, we have been there all before. You might think at the moment, this is the biggest problem that humankind has ever experienced. But the reality is we have been there all before. And this is not to say it somehow that we're not taking your problem seriously, but rather that we take strength out of the fact that in the past, people had to deal with these kind of challenges and they pulled through it. They were okay at the end of the day. So I think what we need to do, we need to validate, of course, the perception that something is really going bad. So if you just come up with a positive story that totally ignores the fact that people have these feelings, then of course people will think that you're just smoking something. So you need to take seriously those concerns, but you need to take seriously them on a kind of emotional level, on an affective level, rather than to say, yes, at the end of the day, the biggest problem of them all is migration, and we've kind of failed, but now we'll listen to you and we come up with this BP version. Because then people will just, that's not a story, that's not a hopeful story, that's not a positive story. And in that moment, people will actually then just vote for the original. And I think that is precisely what we're actually seeing all over the Western world at the moment. We also see that at the moments like that, center right-wing parties, they particularly think they can win back that kind of support. But time and time again, it's not working. So, for instance, it was attempted earliest maybe in Austria with the right-wing populist party there. They now have 38% in opinion polls at the moment, while the center right-wing Austrian People's Party gets about 20%. Or look at the Dutch election from the other day. Everyone is focusing on the fact that the largest party was a left liberal party, but forget that the support for right-wing populist parties remained absolutely the same. It is just that they shifted from one party a little bit to the other. But it continues to be the biggest voting bloc in the Netherlands, right-wing populism. And in the eastern parts of the Netherlands, rural parts, there's now up to 3/4 of people vote for right-wing populist parties. And I think it's precisely because those kinds of narratives have been accepted, while what you should be doing is to say, well, no, this is not the biggest problem of them all. It is something that needs to be solved, but there are big problems that are different kinds, but we've been there before and we can do it. So you need to turn this into a positive story of hope.
I think how you termed it, the psychology, like there is a psychology behind the populist surge. And one of the most common explanations that we often hear is that the democratic backsliding is that democracies are simply failing to deliver, that government hasn't met the people's social or economic expectations. And the story goes on that, citizens feel left behind, they lose faith in democracy and start embracing anti-democratic leaders who promise strong, decisive change, the false prophet or prophecy of these folks. I just read research recently about a dozen countries around the world focusing on backsliding that suggests that the reality is more complicated. Many of these countries' economic frustration plays a role, but it's not the whole story. Like in some cases, voters weren't rejecting democracy itself, but rather rejecting the predatory or what you call the manipulative political actors who exploited grievances and then in the fast-moving media cycle that we're in that is saturating what we hear and what we see. So backsliding is often happening not because democracy fails to deliver, to your point, but because democracy fails to constrain the ambitions of certain elected officials once they're in power. And then that narrative is harder to shift. I don't think voters in Hungary voted for Orban in 2010 thinking we're voting for anti-liberal policies as much as they felt like they were voting for change after being frustrated with corruption and stagnation. You're familiar, I'm sure, with Larry Bartels' political research on illiberalism. He just wrote about a pattern that was playing across countries right now, whether it's in Hungary, Poland, whether it's in Turkey, Bangladesh, India, Tunisia, that there are these false prophets taking advantage of the narrative that's resonating with folks, which historically have always existed somewhere in the air. There's always been this negative ideology, cultural nuance hanging there, and they've just grabbed hold of it and said, let's make it into a narrative that works.
I think that sounds absolutely right. And I think it's also really important what you point out here is that this is playing out across various national boundaries. I think people make far too much of a mistake to always explain something out of the individual or collective failure of actors within each country. So, for instance, in Germany, people now endlessly discuss about whether or not people are where they are because of Angela Merkel and her decision of opening borders in 2015. And there's all these kind of fantasies. Had she just not done that, her Christian Democratic Union would still be the all-dominant party. Totally ignoring that exact same phenomenon that has been playing out in Germany, has been playing out in most other countries where the same kind of erosion of support of the center-right has taken place without Angela Merkel and without an opening of the borders in 2015. So we have to see this as a kind of transboundary crisis, a crisis that is really playing out in all kinds of countries. And also we have to actually see that, yes, there are the people who are benefiting from it, they're negative, absolutely. But their narrative is not necessarily a narrative. We also make a mistake that we kind of often reduce them to a cartoon version of what they said. So when we report about Orban, Erdogan, right-wing politicians elsewhere today, we focus on the most outrageous and hateful thing that we can come up with. And we do the same when looking at the interwar years. But we forget that in between, so we shouldn't just look at these like two sentences that they say in a 2-hour speech, but maybe let's listen to the whole speech, even if it's painful, for 2 hours, and actually see how superficially hopeful a lot of that language is, and also how they often offer the same things that we do or that we cherish, but in a perverted way. I mentioned earlier Mussolini. Mussolini was constantly going on about how Italy needed hope again, how needed a vision, how people needed to be more positive. Hitler said the same thing. Even in terms of democracy, people are not today really saying, look, we no longer want democracy. Democracy sucks. And even at that time, in the war years, people didn't quite say that. Sure, we can find all kinds of quotes where Hitler lashes out at democracy. But then you have to realize he normally says he's lashing out at Marxist democracy, Jewish democracy, liberal democracy, Western democracy, American democracy, you name it. But then he said, what we need to do is we need to improve democracy. We need to come up with a better democracy. And those were also it was very much the theme of his annual speeches while in power to commemorate the Nazis coming to power. The common theme was to actually say, well, look, we are bringing real democracy. They ran on the story of bringing real democracy. They ran on the story of restoring freedom. They ran on a story of restoring values. And we see the same today. And we need to take that seriously. This goes back to what I said. Let's listen to what extremists really say. Let's try to understand the world through their eyes. Let's take seriously the first-person perspective of these extremists to understand how their narratives work, how they're superficially often positive narratives or partially positive narratives. We see what the German novelist Thomas Mann described in an essay he wrote in 1939 about Brother Hitler, where he describes how he finds really disconcerting to realize that there's certain things that he can recognize himself when listening to Hitler. He's basically saying this guy is obviously absolutely horrendous. He's writing this from his emigration in America, so he had to flee the country. But he's still saying he can recognize certain things that he is saying. He can also see that this is being built on, maybe I'm partly putting words now to Thomas Mann, but he's essentially saying Hitler is building on our same family values, but he's just turning them upside down. So he's not somehow saying we don't need empathy, we don't need sympathy, we don't need democracy, we don't need values. He's saying all of that, but he's offering a perversion for that. He is destroying democracy in the name of improving or rescuing democracy. And I think we see precisely the same thing today. We see case after case at the moment where illiberal Democrats or outright or autocrats are destroying liberal democracy in the name of improving or restoring democracy.
It's an interesting process by which this happens and why it happens, because when we put it to the average person and you talk to them, the voter, about what they're voting for, why they're voting for it, who they're voting for, many people would say, I'm voting for a better future for my children. I'm voting for a better job. I'm voting so that I have the country I grew up in exists for my grandchildren. You hear all of these things. And those elected officials or politicians saying that's what we're trying to restore, knowing that once they get into power, they're going to do as much as possible to dismantle the very process that got them into power, which is the democratic process. That this idea that you're getting someone in office who is talking in an anti-democratic way, but in a way that resonates freedom and safe borders. As a voter, you're not voting for the end of democracy, but you're voting for democracy working better for you.
Exactly.
But in essence, when you vote for these folks, it turns around and suddenly you realize wait a second. What I value is now being undermined. And so it's sort of an interesting concept for me to think about what you just said, like the citizens. When we talk about it, we think about it, well, people vote. They're stupid. They're voting badly. They're doing the wrong thing. And the danger doesn't lie in citizens failing, but I think it lies in more that there is a system that fails to check the powerful, that allows for this kind of narrative and undermining of democracy to be able to take hold through the democratic process. So it's this question of, but where can you check the powerful during the process of people being organized to be supporters of this political positioning that doesn't say we're autocrats or we're authoritarian, but we're fighters for freedom, we're fighters for democracy. Somewhere along that process, some of us go, that's BS, that's a false prophet. And many other people go, this is our savior. And then they get tricked. And then we see what we see now, this very questionable time, I think, in global democracy, where many people at the same time feel that their institutions, their democratic way of life is constantly under threat.
And there's a real problem. The problem is to even get through to people, to be able to tell people, look, you're being lied to here, or this is the process, what's happening here, because we no longer have any institutions that are being universally trusted as independent organizations that would either verify or falsify that what people are saying, that would say something is BS. This in a way also goes back to what I said earlier about the media landscape. I mean, I don't want to idolize the past, so it's not like that there were all these independent organizations that everyone accepted, but there was still, I mean, so for instance, in the United Kingdom, there was a high degree of trust in what, for instance, the BBC was reporting. So people would still always bicker that maybe the BBC should do this or that. But ultimately, there was still a belief, if that is what they report, something close to that probably really did take place. And you can come up with similar institutions in other countries. But that is increasingly eroding. So the very belief that there is still something that, I was going to say that there is something like truth that it no longer exists, but that's not true. People generally are on both sides of these divides. They're committed to truth, but they no longer can agree on common procedures or institutions on how you can figure out whether something is right or wrong, truth or false. And here we have a real problem, because now everything then becomes just relational. So everyone is saying the same. Everyone says that they're bringing real freedom. Everyone is saying that they're telling the truth. Everyone is saying they want to improve democracy. And everyone is saying that the respective other side is doing the exact opposite. And if you now have no institution that can actually tell people what is happening here, or that they trust in that, then they will just go with whoever will, in an emotional sense, in an effective sense, seems closest to them at that point in time. And so if then the institutions of these extremists basically validate what have just been heard in the eyes of these supporters, then it doesn't help if then the BBC or whoever says, well, look, this is not what is really happening here. So you can really no longer get through at all. And that is really, really scary. But of course, I don't want to now just be the doomsday sayer too. I'll try to come up with something hopeful. So, I mean, my hopeful pitch here would be that we really need to do two things. I mean, one is we really need to work with individuals who still have a high degree of respectability within communities that they still listen to. And we need to appeal to them and to explain to them why they really need to help us. And when I mean help us, I don't mean to help a particular political cause, a particular political option in any given time, but that they need to help us to restore the ability to tell what is right or wrong, and that points out to people the processes that are happening here. And I think that is also borne out with research that has been done, that is kind of the best chance for de-radicalization is if radicals start to realize, well, two things. If they start to realize that the story that had been told to them is not really delivering, so that they're starting to doubt being expressed through that way. And if that is now being amplified by community leaders, whether that's be a religious leader, whether it's a community leader, whether it's someone at the workplace, people who they trust, if at that moment that those people tell extremists, look, without actually blaming them, but or just so like pushing them further. So there needs to be also some kind of positive message connected to that. We said, well, look, you've gone the wrong way, but we understand why. You need to connect with your true self. You need to connect again with your better angels, if you will, and the better angels of our own community. So you need to kind of community leaders who give people a sense that what they had abandoned really was still part of them, that you can return to that. I mean, I've just done interviews with Holocaust survivors about the future of democracy. And that is really one of the things that struck with me, that Margaret Friedlander, the Holocaust survivor who recently died, she kept on saying, on the one, her message is just very simple. So let's just be human and so on. But she also has got these very powerful words where she says, look, even when she's being challenged, aren't there some people who are really just bad and so on? She said, no, actually, I believe in the good of the people. I believe everyone has something good in them. Now, we can endlessly discuss whether, objectively speaking, that is true. But just by conveying that image, you're already halfway there, because you make it possible for people to come back from the brink. So if you just say, you're a total racist, you're irredeemable, or the only way you're redeemable is by totally breaking with your own identity and outward becoming me, you will probably not get there. But if you say, look, you don't have to become me, you don't have to become a mini version of me, but you actually have got to just go back to your own roots, then you can get through there. And I think it is at that moment that these narratives, these false narratives, can be contaminated. There's a really interesting book that people really should be reading, which is about a more specific process of radicalization. It's a process of radicalization of Islamist and right-wing terrorists by the Dutch historian Beatrice de Graaf, who wrote a book called The Radical Redemption Model. And for that, she interviewed about 30 former terrorists in Indonesia and the Netherlands and looked at how these processes work there. And it is precisely what she describes there about how these stories of redemption have to be contaminated. And that process needs to, in part, come from within people, but then needs to be strengthened by these community leaders. And I think that is something we can also apply far more widely in a societal sense, not just to terrorists or not just to people who have gone that far off the rails, but to kind of anyone, where you need to find ways of contaminating the narratives of these extremists, and to actually show, and in the process, to actually show that the narratives were false narratives, and that, sure, these people might have promised freedom, democracy, and so on, but that's not what was really happening. In reality, these narratives were ones that were creating misery in the world. They were creating misery for the people you want to de-radicalize, but that were creating misery for everyone. So I think that is something that you need to do and that you can do. And the second part of my somewhat hopeful answer is that I think we really need to invest in restoring basic values, how we all deal with each other. And again, the problem here, of course, is Hitler would have said the same thing. Extremists say the same thing. But just because they've done it in a perverted way doesn't make it wrong. We've seen in recent years real erosion of those kind of values, how we'll deal with each other, how we'll, even with the very value of empathy. And we've, of course, seen that someone like Elon Musk explicitly went out against empathy. So we need to restore those kind of values so that we try to look through the world not through just our own eyes, but also through the eyes of others. How we need to deal with people as adversaries, not as enemies, that we initially provide some kind of trust into people. It is those kind of values that need to be restored if you want to be able to also restore, for instance, institutions that through which we can figure out what is right, what is wrong, what is truth, what is not truth, and how generally we'll deal with each other. The problem is, of course, it's not an easy fix. So we can't just say to politician X or Y, you just need to get a new act of parliament or a new decree and you will solve all this, because ultimately this is a problem that needs to be solved outside of politics. It's what sometimes called pre-political values. And they need to start even with all of us. I think in a way we should also always ask ourselves, are we ourselves part of the problem or part of the solution to the problem? How are we dealing with each other? How are we interacting with people on social media? Are we really the kind of people we want to be? If we are not, what is the start, how we can do this? But that is, of course, a very slow process, but I think it needs to happen anyway.
It's a process that lends itself to democratic accountability, because I do think oftentimes it's not necessarily front of mind how much our accountability to one another in the society. Let's put aside your governmental governance structure, that if you don't have accountability within your society, it undermines the ability to find common ground, to build bridges, and having an opportunity to reinforce what has been eroded in democratic societies by reinstating accountability. And it starts, I think, I've talked about this on the podcast, it starts with everyday people, like you just said, talking to your neighbors, having challenging conversations with friends and family, listening to one another even when you don't agree, and creating that space where accountability to one another's experiences and fears, and even if they're not accurate or based on facts, but that they do exist for people. There's the perception of what people feel, as you called it, the crisis of perception, the emotion of what people feel, and then finding a way to create space for that to be part of how do we hold accountable the things that we fear. And I think for most people, it's social and economic, right? Like people can frame it. I'm afraid of what's happening in society. I'm afraid what's happening economically. But when you take that and put it, and these are things that you're afraid of, but they're complements to the broader issues. They're not substitutes for the things that really should be at the forefront of how we are governed as a society, and what and how our institutions function in order for us to have stronger democratic institutions, building democratic resilience, and making sure that by doing that, we are limiting or minimizing the opportunity for the rise of false prophets to come in and to take advantage of this one fear, which is really about the political system, is not necessarily addressing the need for people to feel that there's an accountability to their needs as people within their governing structure. I started this podcast because I really wanted to engage people in conversations around what democracy looks like and where it starts from, how it should be in the moments of crises. And I think that we forget that historically, this is not our first rodeo. It might be our first rodeo, but it's not the first rodeo in the process of democratic evolution.
We should also really try to see that in these previous rodeos, not everyone fell off the horse. The So, for instance, if we look at the case of interwar Europe, in about 60% of the cases, democracy fell from within. In about 40% of the cases, democracy survived. And again, these transboundary crises existed in all of these countries to varying degrees. And there were various cases where, let's say, from the perspective of 1920, you would have said which countries will make it and which countries won't make it. With some, you can kind of say, yeah, that's probably not looking so good, or other ones, that's looking probably promising. But there were so many in between where it was kind of unclear whether they would make it. And I think we need to study far more those kind of cases where there were narrow misses, but democracy survived. And we need to take inspiration from them. We need to try to figure out why it is that is in those countries democracy survived. Despite that kind of problem, we also, as I said earlier, we need to understand that we as humans are very resilient, that in a way, it's a fallacy that things always collapse. We already mentioned that just the book by Beatrice de Graaf, but another thing people might want to look at, there's a lecture that they can see on the YouTube channel of the Extreme Beliefs program at the university, the Free University in Amsterdam, where she talks precisely about this fallacy of collapse. That somehow people think that this kind of rise and fall and this collapse of societal collapse is the norm. But the reality is resilience is the norm. And I think once we actually realize that resilience is the norm, we'll start to look elsewhere on how we can get through these crises. If we, in a way, why we're always looking at cases of collapse in order to understand the success factors of democratic survival. We should look at cases of democratic survival in order to get inspiration. It's of course a little bit difficult because, of course, it's difficult to explain the non-occurrence of something. And of course, it's also, and I'm as guilty as anyone here, it's often more exciting to write about something that blows up, about revolutions, and I'm guilty as anyone. I'm the guy who has written books about the radicalization of Hitler. But we should always look at both sides of the divide, and increasingly are doing both. I mean, just brought together 19 scholars where we precisely try to look at these kind of common drivers of democratic breakdown, but also look at kind of sources of resilience from the past, and or even doing the same. In January, I'm teaching this online course, which anyone in the world could take, on understanding extremism through the prism of Adolf Hitler. But precisely the point here is, yes, we will be looking in this course on the case of Hitler, but we will also be looking in the same course on cases of democratic survival in order to really understand the kind of the patterns of extremism and resilience to extremism, in the hope that if people who either take this course or read this book, that they'll see the general patterns of democratic breakdown and democratic survival, and in the hope that if they understand those kind of patterns from the past, that they will also see similar patterns in the present and take inspiration from that. And again, this goes back to that we've been there all before, and we can get through it.
Yeah, that's a really important and powerful reminder. I want to thank you for this conversation today. It's a lot of information. I'm glad I had a chance to talk with you and share just the thinking and process with you. You were fantastic.
Thank you so much.
In today's episode, we explored the rise of authoritarian populism, the challenges it poses to democratic institutions, and what citizens can do to protect democratic values. Professor Weber shared fascinating insights into how political polarization and social media influence our political landscape. I hope this conversation inspires you to think critically, ask questions, and engage actively in your community. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite platform so you never miss an episode. If you enjoyed today's discussion, leave us a review and share it with your friends to keep the conversation going. Check out the show notes for the links to books, videos, and other resources mentioned in today's episode. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and let's keep democracy alive. Talk with you soon.